Welcome to the Trail and Ultra Running Training Podcast. My name is Will Franz, and I'm here to help you improve your training so you can have more fun out on the trails. Welcome back to the Trail and Ultra Running Training Podcast. Whether you're watching this on video in the Facebook group or whether you're listening to this on your podcast app of choice, I appreciate you being here. And if you find this useful, I would love if you would share it with somebody or leave a rating and review. All of those things help more people find it. And that's really the whole goal of me putting this thing out in the first place, is to provide more free information to more people so we can, have more fun out on trails while reducing risk of injury and just having a good time doing what we love to do. So today, let's talk about ways that we tend to get distracted, and specifically some of these tests that I get asked about on a fairly regular basis. So I'd say on an average of like once a week, maybe more. Some weeks it's going to be like 3 times. Some weeks it's not, how averages work. Someone asks me something like, do you think I should get a VO2 max test? Or what do you think about lactate testing? And I get it. You want targeted training. All of us want some form of targeted training because it allows you to get better results in less time, which means those big races that you want to do, we can do them sooner and we can just get more done in life. Because in the grand scheme of things, life is short. We probably all have more things we want to do than we're going to have time to do. So I totally understand the impulse to create this very targeted training stimulus so that we can get the most out of our little time that we have, right? I fully respect that. But for most of us, these tests just aren't going to make a huge difference. And in many instances, they actually might be more negative than positive. And that might feel confusing. We'll break it down in a second. So first, for most people, the big bottleneck to progress is rarely that you aren't training specifically enough. It is usually not that your heart rate should be at like 140 instead of 145. It is usually much less granular than that. More often than not, we are not seeing a ton of progress because we miss 1 or 2 runs out of every week because we just don't plan our schedule well enough in advance. It is because we miss speed training. Like if we do 4 speed training sessions a month, then you miss 2 of them. That's like half of your speed training. And that's why we don't get faster. Or we spend all of our runs in the exact same training zone. So this is where we hear people call the gray zone. And just a sidebar, because it is a pet peeve of mine, the gray zone isn't real. It's an important zone for training. If this low zone 3 lactate area weren't useful, then we probably wouldn't see as much progress from the Norwegians because they do a lot of training there. This is the whole Norwegian training thing. It's this flux training idea. But if you spend all of your time there and don't do any real work in zone 2 and lower and don't do any easy runs, then you're not going to make progress because that needs to be the bulk of your training. Because when we have nothing but intensity, you are going to struggle to recover, and eventually you're either going to get injured or be forced to take a long deload, right? So our big things is that we miss our runs or miss important runs or just don't train in an appropriate variability of training zones or whatever it may be for you. And yes, when we look at something like VO2 max testing or lactate testing or really getting into heart rate work, it helps create specificity. To deny that would be insane, and that's really cool. But for most of us, it's probably not going to make any meaningful change to your training unless you're just doing it. It's not going to make a meaningful change to your training that we couldn't get by a much simpler means. Let's put it that way, right? Because there are a lot of people who don't look into any sort of training idea. They do some kind of like, be it VO2 max testing or like test their max heart rate. And then this gives them training targets along with that to hit or like spend most of their time in. And then they will actually do a large percentage of their running in, say, zone 2 or below on the 5-zone model. And that means that they're going to get a lot and be able to get a lot more training in because they'll recover better. We could, instead of going through the time and effort and frustration, a VO2 max test is hard. You go to fit, you strap a mask to your face, and then you go really hard on a treadmill that either keeps getting faster or keeps getting steeper until you basically fall off the treadmill. And that is how we get your VO2 max. And then we use that to adjust zones by the data they took along the way, right? Like, that is a difficult thing. It's probably going to take a couple days to recover from that much output. It is actually variable. They have adjusted people's VO2 max in the span of like 2 days based on different training parameters and a whole lot of like psychographics. Like they tell people that it works harder or whatever. They can adjust it based on food. All sorts of things can actually adjust that number. So it's not a perfect number. It can give you a range. So it will still give us a like good target. It's not that it's useless. It's just, it is not going to make most of your training better, because instead of like doing this test, we could just be honest with ourselves and use what we'd call like a ventilatory threshold, which is really accurate for most people. If you can like speak in a pretty decent conversation, but somebody else with whom you're speaking would know that you're running, and you probably don't want to be having the conversation. So I'm pretty stuffy right now because I was sick over the weekend, so I can't breathe through my nose at all. So right now I'm breathing entirely through my mouth while speaking a lot of words. I am struggling a little bit to breathe, and if it sounds like this or maybe a little harder, then you're probably hitting the bag. I couldn't sing right now, really, even if I wanted to, and that just means I'm going to be in that like upper end of zone 2. Whereas if you can say about a full sentence and a half, probably in that lactate threshold. And if you can only say like 3 to 5 words, and most of them are going to probably be profanity, then you're probably more in the like VO2 max or zone like 4 and 5 space. And that will take you so far. We don't need a lot more than that if we're being super honest. And one of the things that I'm really worried about when we go into some of these testing parameters and get super specific metrics is that for some people, it causes them to train less. Because if you like, say you nail your heart rate zones, and we know that like a wrist-based like watch heart rate monitor, this one's a little damaged, so it doesn't work anyway, but these just aren't quite as accurate as a chest strap. And if we know that, and you don't even forget your watch, you forget your chest strap at home, I know people who have not done a training session because they were so invested in heart rate training and they forgot their chest strap at home when they got to the trailhead that they just didn't do their run. And if there are things like that where it might have any chance of limiting your training session or reducing your training volume because we get so obsessed about the metrics, then that is not a positive thing for you and your training. And for a lot of ultra runners are like super type A, super data driven. And when we give more points of data, it can just create more anxiety and more concern about doing it wrong. So I actually really worry about a lot of these testing metrics because we end up very obsessed about the numbers instead of just getting out there and putting in the training hours. And a lot of the time, this is mostly relevant to people who are super new. But I see this across the board on all sorts of tests, be they like VO2 max tests, blood lactate tests, supplements, breathing mechanics, gait mechanics, blah, blah, blah. Like all of these things can lead to some level of obsession that reduces our efficacy and volume when it comes to just getting out there and doing the work and keeping it fun. Because a lot of these obsessions over metrics can also just ruin the sport. We got into this because it was a fun time, and if you were checking your watch every 3 seconds because you're worried, or it's constantly beeping at you because you're kind of out of this zone or whatever, it tends to just mess it up. And if that's not you, that's great. But for most people, it's not a super fun time. And I'm not saying don't keep your runs easy, but if we can do it something along the lines of like ventilatory threshold, and then still wear some level of heart rate to just like check it after the fact and see how you did, then that's really good enough for most people. It really is. Like, you can make an insane amount of progress without these very detailed metrics for years. And this is the other thing. The problem is context, as always. And when I get a message about almost any of these things, I'm not sure it has ever been a person who has been training consistently for years. It is almost always someone new who's chasing a goal and who's training like they want to hit that goal really quickly. And as a result, they want to make the most out of their training. But one, you probably shouldn't run a 100-miler in your first year of running. I just don't think that's a great idea for many reasons. It's going to take over your life. There are some people for whom they fall passionately in love with this sport, and that's all they want to do. And power to you. If that's you, that's lovely. For most people, it's just not a stellar plan. But we still can make a ton of progress without getting obsessed with these metrics. Now, you just have to do the training is the thing. And most of us don't train hard enough or consistently enough for it to matter. So they serve as distractions more than they actually serve as help, right? And that's why I don't do these things and why I don't really have anybody do these things whom I train. I train some fantastic athletes who are getting and targeting sub 24-hour hundreds and achieving big goals. And there's a bunch of stuff on the map this year, and never had them strap a mask to their face or prick their finger a bunch of times to get lactate levels through a training session, because it really just wouldn't change how I train them. And there are coaches who do these things, and that's great. Jason Koop absolutely does these things because he, based on a whole host of factors, tends to train incredibly elite athletes where a couple minutes on, or a couple percentage points of whatever, can make a massive difference. He also has access to a very easy access to the Olympic Training Center where they can just run these tests. You also have people who have been struggling for a decade, who have plateaued and just cannot make progress. And if we're in that instance, then these tests can be useful, because you might learn something that is completely off, that we just haven't been doing, or why you're not seeing progress. But again, most of the time, you can see that by just looking at your training over the past 2 years. Again, if you've been training for a long time and are really struggling to see progress, then something like a VO2 max test or lactate testing can show you, can give you a curve, can give you a pace curve, can give you an effort curve of exactly what's going on and why you might be struggling. But one, they aren't permanently relevant. That's kind of the whole point. If you look at a VO2 max test, it can really target your training now. It can show you where you're deficient. It'll show you this curve of this is where you popped lactate, this is where you popped it again, this is where you're hitting your VO2 max. And we can see if this curve looks like it's really supposed to, or if it's super linear, you just need to throw a ton of training at the person. But we can also probably figure that out by just looking at your training. If you've been training for 10 years and you have mostly been doing hiking and slow running, and you haven't done a speed session in the past 3 years, then we really just need to have you run fast and put a big stimulus of speed and intensity on your body, and you're going to get faster. It's not a magic secret. And Lactate, also super effective. It's really tedious though, and it's kind of painful because you need to stab yourself in the finger or the ear a lot. And it's a little sensitive because you need to clean yourself with sweat, which is a real pain when you're running and a big pain when you're outside where most of us are going to be training. And it's again, super tedious, probably not going to make a big difference. So if you've been struggling, then they can really be useful. But we should ask ourselves some questions first. Are you training consistently, week in, week out, with a fairly decent, regular deload that is responsible for you and your situation? Are you training in a wide range of cardiac zones? Are you spending most of your time running easy, getting a good amount in the middle zone, and then a little bit, but not skipping, but a little bit of this upper VO2 work? If so, if you can answer all of those questions and still just cannot figure it out, then these things could be really worthwhile. But I would also probably start with some field tests because they're free and you don't have to go find a training center and spend a bunch of money and gas yourself out. You could easily just figure out a pace curve. Run a hard mile, run a hard 10K, and then compare those to what your pace is for an ultra. Let's say your hard mile pace is a 7-minute mile and your ultra pace is a 13-minute mile. I realize that's actually fast for a 100-miler for most people, but if we're not including stoppage time and the fact that night just fatigues you, what could you run for 12 hours, 50-miler? Let's say that, 13-minute mile. Your hard 10K should be somewhere in the middle, and it should show some distinction between all of these paces. If your hard 10K were a 7:30-minute mile and your hard mile were a 7-minute mile, then you really need some VO2 max work or you need to do a ton of strength training. Kind of depends on how you feel, but that is going to be your big limiter there, that there's no gap between those two things. And I don't need to strap a face mask to you to learn that. I just need to have you go run really hard for a short period of time. Mile's going to take you 10 or less minutes. A 10K is going to take you about an hour for most people. And we can knock out what that is based on how you feel and what your performance difference is between all these three things. And all these, all that is to say is these tests can be useful. If you're really struggling, you've been super consistent, and you've been knocking all the buttons down and checking all the boxes, then these things might be worth your time. But field tests are often just as useful, and for most of us, these things are going to provide more of a distraction and an excuse not to train than they will actually direct anything. And if you want any guidance, as always, please shoot me a message. That's what I'm here for. I'm here to help. You can reach out to me on Instagram or Facebook or whatever may have you, or book some time on my calendar. My contact information is everywhere. So I hope this was helpful, and have a great rest of your day. We'll be back with another one soon. Thank you for listening to the Trail and Ultra Running Training Podcast. Honestly, I'm still surprised and honored that anybody wants to hear what I have to say, so thank you. To be clear, not a doctor, nor a registered dietitian, or any other kind of medical professional. I'm a personal trainer, a nutrition coach, and a running coach, and I have a passion for training trail runners. You should always speak with a qualified medical professional before making any changes to your training or nutrition program. If you enjoyed the podcast or found it helpful, please take a second to leave a rating or review. I'd really appreciate it. Or you could just share it with someone for whom you think it might be helpful. I make these kinds of things in order to provide more quality, free resources to people, so the more people who hear it, the better. If you want more of this information, please head to the Trail and Ultra Running Training group on Facebook, where we discuss all aspects of training so you can have more fun doing the sport that you love. Thank you again for listening.